All right. Welcome. It is the 22nd of June, 2020, and this is the ESIP Soil Ontology and Information Cluster. And Adam Shepard is going to be talking with us about schema.org today. So take it away, Adam.
Well, first of all, just thank you for having me here. Really appreciate getting an opportunity to talk about the work of the schema.org cluster. So it's been talked about quite a bit at ESIP for a long while now. And so I thought it might be useful just to sort of circle back and rethink how we talk about it and describe it, hopefully in a fresh way. And so I kind of wanted to just start with, like, what is schema.org even? What is this thing and how is it useful? And then we can sort of talk about how it might be useful in science data, and then maybe even for the soil cluster today. So as I understand it, schema.org is really just this vocabulary that can be used inside a web page to describe the contents of that particular page. And so this started, more than 10 years ago, by the major search engines all sort of got together and built this vocabulary to describe things like hotels and businesses and places and things like that. And the vocabulary has just sort of grown over time to encompass more and more concepts. And so schema.org, if you go to that URL in your browser, you'll hit a landing page that sort of describes all these types that can be turned into metadata that you then embed on that web page and all the properties about those things. And so here's just the top page of hotel on schema.org. And what's interesting is that you can see that the types are hierarchical. And so hotel inherits from a lodging business, which inherits from a local business, and then interestingly inherits from two other disparate classes called organizations and places, and then ultimately from this sort of like base level thing called a thing, which is interesting. So sort of like bring it back down to reality. Schema.org, if you were to embed this schema.org data into your web page, what it allows is the major search engines and other website aggregators to look at that metadata and understand, because of the vocabulary, what certain pieces of the content on that page mean. And so for those who might have searched for a hotel at ESIP down in downtown Pittsburgh, you'll notice that the Wyndham Grand Pittsburgh Hotel is where the meeting's happening. And if you were to Google for that hotel, you see all this really interesting content. So, the name, and you can get to the website, directions to it. You can check availability over certain dates. You can see what sort of hotel amenities are offered, and then even call the hotel directly right from the web page. And so if we were to highlight some elements on that page, these are all things that you could describe and more in schema.org data on a particular web page describing the Wyndham Grand Pittsburgh Hotel. All right, and so, schema.org has been around for a while, and it's really just sort of had this groundswell of adoption in the sort of standard web publishing realm. And so there's a number of tools out there. Here's a particular tool for building schema.org data about a hotel. And so you can enter in your information about a particular hotel, and this tool will generate that for you, which is really interesting. And so as we were talking earlier, you can see the places where the name is, and you saw that displayed on the Google result earlier, in the URL, where if you were to click that website button, you might go to that particular URL. The contact details would be where that sort of like click to call would use that information. And then of course the amenities and the location for like directions and things. And so hopefully you're getting a sense of like how this sort of structured data now embedded into a website turns into something that is actionable for Google. And we'll get into that a little bit more about what actionable is. So, ultimately, schema.org is data on a web page that informs search engines or others about what your page content is about. using schemas agreed upon not only by the publishers of websites, but also the consumers. And so you can think of consumers as those major search engines or content aggregators. And so that's interesting because typically these vocabularies sometimes are closed, and, not to point fingers at Google or anything, but, maybe they would just sort of work on this and develop it their own, but they've really opened up development of schema.org to the community. And so new concepts, new properties can be proposed, and they're discussed on GitHub. And then if there's enough support for these, they will end up in schema.org in the vocabulary. And so this is really a dialogue between publishers and consumers on what should be available and be expressed ultimately on web pages using this vocabulary. And then ultimately it's for making content actionable. And this is really where it becomes powerful. And if you think about that web page that we looked at earlier on the Wyndham Hotel, there, all those sort of buttons that were clickable is really what makes that sort of hotel description actionable. Being able to call up directions to the hotel, to call the hotel directly, or even to check for availability online. Those are things that make that content actionable. And that was really the sort of the benefit here of schema.org, is that you could do so much more on the web, outside of the particular website that publishes that page. Other folks, search engines and whoever, can do things with the data that is found on your page. So ultimately, what is actionable content? And we've talked about that a little bit. That's these sort of boxes that we see here. All these things are actionable and sort of draw the user who's searching the web to do certain things and interact with the content on a particular page. And what's really cool is that actions are unique to the content itself. And so the actions that are provided for, let's say, a hotel might be completely different from the actions provided by other types found in schema.org. And this is really cool because it means that there's not some like lowest common denominator of actions, but the actions can really grow out of the nature of the content itself. And so this is where schema.org gets really exciting. So, we've been talking about hotels, but then you have other types that might be more interesting on the research science side, such as a research project. And so we can describe what a research project is using schema.org on the web. But then ultimately we can describe data sets too. And this is sort of what sort of spurred on this curiosity inside ESIP to look at what can be done with schema.org with respect to data sets. And so what does this mean for science data? That data set pages can have the ability to provide action outside of those websites themselves. And so what does it mean for a data set to be actionable at Google per se, or a content aggregator like Data1? And so these are really interesting questions. And so the schema.org cluster at ESIP, while it's been formed fairly new, it was established in 2019. There's been some sessions at ESIP going back to like probably even 2014 with Peter Fox, who was just really exploring what can be done with data sets using the schema.org vocabulary. And so some of the things that have naturally just sort of spawned from those discussions is that researchers really want to go to Google and find data sets. They don't necessarily want to go to a particular repository, let's say a thematic repository. They just kind of want to type in their keywords and the things they're looking for at Google. And so that might be one action. Another action might be the need to download that data directly, maybe in different formats. Thirdly, it's to visualize that data. And so can we bring it into tools and plot that data and understand it in a new way visually? But also just sort of more fine-grained searches. And so can we draw over a particular area of a map, let's say, and just find data that's relevant to that geometry? And so those are all actions that have naturally come to mind as folks have talked about actions for data sets, but the possibilities are endless. And so There might be actions that are very specific to a community such as yours, like so soil data. There might be some really cool tools that everyone uses in your community. And so how can we make that actionable? And so schema.org in the context of data sets for the science community really begs this question of what do we want to do with data and how can we help the search engines and machine aggregators do those things for our user base. So the science on schema.org is a GitHub repository that sort of is the collection of work all done by schema.org enthusiasts at ESIP. And so this cluster has really just sort of provided this message that schema.org is like this common publishing pattern for describing research data on your web pages using the schema.org language. And so while schema.org sort of came out of like the major search engine web publishing realm, it sort of nicely overlaps with what's already happening at repositories with describing data sets using metadata. So like, DOI records or ISO metadata or EML. And so these types of activities of building structured data to describe data sets is something that our community already does. And what the schema.org cluster is trying to do is just sort of bring that same focus to schema.org so that folks like the major search engines can make that metadata that we already publish actionable. All right, so I mentioned a GitHub repository. You can find that at ESIP-Fed under the ESIP-Fed organization at scienceonschema.org. And what we're looking at here is just sort of the main page on that GitHub. And right away, we're saying, hey, we have guidelines, examples, and an issue queue for sort of two major topics. First, for describing data sets, and two, for also describing data repositories. There's some other resources on there, like how to get started, like how to get involved with the group, how to use the guidelines. And then, yeah, so we've had a ton of success with this GitHub repository. We can't be more thrilled to have sort of 80 folks watching the repository, or excuse me, 30 folks watching the repository and 80 stars. A number of forks, which is great. It just means that the community is involved and really interested in this content here. And we're really excited about what's happening there. So the cluster itself, we meet monthly, and right now we're meeting twice a month. And what we do is we sort of monitor the issue queue at GitHub first. That's sort of our primary activity, trying to resolve issues, address concerns, or proposals, and elevate, if it is a proposal, elevate those to schema.org if we feel like that's something that might be useful there. But we also monitor schema.org itself. And so schema.org publishes a monthly update, monthly changes. And so we look for things that might be relevant to data sets and data repositories and other scientifically related types at the vocabulary for inclusion in our guidelines. And then also we just sort of maintain and publish and update these guidelines. And so since 2019, we have published 3 versions or 3 updates to the guidelines, and those primarily resolve around the data repository and the data set, like I mentioned. All right, and so what's the need for these guidelines? Like if you go to schema.org, the website itself, you can find guidelines on how to publish that content right now. And what's interesting is that schema.org almost encourages domains to sort of have their own guidance through the types. And so the guidance, yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to stop you here for a minute. Your slide deck apparently cut in half for some reason.
Oh, okay.
There you go. Much better.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
No worries.
All right. So the guidelines, why the ESIP cluster creates their own guidelines is really just to hone in on sort of domain specific or the type specific guidance and encouragement to use the vocabulary in a consistent and reliable way. And what that enables is increased federation across adopters, but also lets us do things downstream. So like once people have published schema.org on their web pages, to almost like validate that, and we can validate that for the community against the guidelines and the recommendations that we've made. All right, and so the other reason that we've created these guidelines is that if you go to schema.org, it's really just sort of a textual description of the types and the properties of those types. And so what our community has done has also been to build out these diagrams and really walk the user through the individual properties and how it might be used in the best way. And so we just looked at the describing a data repository. And here I just want to highlight all the sorts of metadata fields we can talk about with the schema.org definition. And so we can talk about identifiers such as DOIs or local identifiers at a repository. We can speak to the variables and how they're described, including external vocabularies that might be used to describe those variables. We can talk about the catalogs that the data set might live in, the metadata records associated to that data set. Distributions is almost like the downloadable files. So let's say a particular data set could be downloaded as MATLAB or NetCDF. This would be one way to describe direct links to all those particular files. And as a subnote, we can also talk about service endpoint. So if the data isn't available directly, but you need to hit some API endpoint, there's a way to describe that to schema.org. And then also like temporal and spatial coverages, roles such as authors, contributors, publishers, and providers, and then ultimately funding, the awards that funded those, and then licenses. All right, and we also talked about these drawings so far, some prose descriptions about what those drawings mean and our interpretation of the guidelines, but also we include some snippets of examples of what the schema.org would look like for a particular property of a data set. And so you'll find in the guidelines tons of examples of variations of, well, it could be done this way or this way, and these ways are valid. And we also talk about ways that might trip up the search engines as well. And just some more examples and drawings for you all. Okay, so down to the nitty gritty of how we manage the guidelines as a cluster. One of the things we wanted to nail right away was, okay, how do we govern these documents? What's the process there? And so naturally we have the ESIP telecons that are happening twice a month. We certainly use the Google Doc to sort of keep track of our agendas, and we build agendas leading up to the calls. That's primarily derived out of the GitHub issue queue. So we depend on GitHub very much. But we've also adopted this technique called architecture decision records. And the reason that we've done that is that we've found in most other projects that a particular issue in GitHub could sort of go on for a very long time and run very lengthy. And for newcomers, it's really hard to sort of jump into a GitHub repository and mine through all the issues and understand the context around a particular issue and the decision that it ultimately led. And so these architecture decision records are just a small little document that sums up a decision made by the cluster. And so you might get a very brief context on the issue, the status of the issue, so whether it's still being discussed or if it's been decided. You'll get context as to like the meaningful information to understand the issue, and then ultimately the consequences of the decision that was made. And so we've often had times where a decision is maybe reversed or corrected. And so the architecture decision record helps us define decisions in the past and sort of see how we've changed our minds without having to sort of mine through one particular GitHub issue. Okay, so here's just a quick screenshot of our issue queue, particularly focusing on issues related to the data set. and then our Google Doc notes, which we embed with links directly to the issues, which then ultimately get rolled up into decision records. And these decision records look somewhat like this. So I'm showing on the left-hand side the template for those ADRs, we call them. And then down the right-hand side, just the ADRs we have, and they're numbered in that way to correspond to the issue number. So for example, issue discussion, but this ADR 101 would describe that issue in a much condensed manner and how the cluster made a decision. All right, so how often are the guidelines updated? That largely depends on the issues. We just pushed our latest release 2 weeks ago, version 1.3. We DOI each decision, or excuse me, each sort of like release in Zenodo, which is great for us. It helps us keep track of those things, and get a DOI not only for the individual releases, but for the whole series. And so in this latest release, we've described how to link data sets to the awards and the funders of those awards, which is a huge win for us and for the funders. Also the variables, which we talked about a little bit earlier, how to use external vocabularies to describe in detail what those variables mean inside a data set. Before now, you could only use ISO time to describe the temporal coverage of a data set. And so we had someone from the MAGIC repository that deals with geologic time. So we're talking about time scales on like millions of years and things like that. And so in this latest release, you'll be able to talk about the temporal coverage of a data set in geologic time, which is a huge win for us, we think. And then just some smaller issues, sort of like preserving item order in schema.org is a little tricky. It's a little bit convoluted, but when you have a list of authors, let's say, and that data is being read by another entity, you want to ensure that the order is preserved specifically around authors and contributors. And so we describe how web publishers can ensure that the order of their authors and contributors are preserved. And then just some more examples of what schema.org should look like for some of the types and properties. And then someone from the group created a shackle shape, which would help validate records published in schema.org, just so that you can understand how well you're complying with the Science on Schema.org guidelines. Yeah. So lastly, I just kind of want to end with, please get involved. We have, like I said, two telecons a month on the first Monday at 5 p.m. Eastern and the fourth Thursday at 2:30 Eastern. That next telecon is totally wrong. I will update that slide. But yeah, we have a mailing list. We're on Slack if you want to find us there. And we do have a Twitter account, which we don't use a ton, but use it more just for announcing major releases. So yeah, that's all I have for today. I'm really excited to hear what you guys think of schema.org and if you have any use for it in the soil cluster and how our cluster might be of help or of service to you all. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam. That was absolutely fascinating. So I wanted to roll back a little bit and ask you, I guess I'll take prerogative and get the first question. I wanted to ask you about your architecture design records and how did that evolve, that sort of governance and decision-making pipeline for your cluster?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think as the cluster moved to using GitHub, there were a few in the cluster who had experienced just sort of like the pain of having these long conversations with the open community. Mm-hmm. And that might have come from experience at like W3C community lists, where you have like some experts weighing in on an issue and non-experts chiming in. And so for the newcomer, it's really hard to decipher who's who if you're just jumping into a particular issue. And so we felt like the architecture decision record sort of democratized the decision, right? So it's not um, um, what's the right word?
Tyranny
Uh,
of the masses.
yeah. You sort of get like the consensus on a certain topic. And so we found that really helpful for just increasing the time to contribution for newcomers in
Mhm,
the group.
mhm. All right. Stephen, I know you came in a little bit late. Do you have any questions that you caught?
I do. Yeah, I'm sorry I'm late. I had a little appointment this morning. Adam, hey, my name's Steve. I'm information manager at the CAP LTR at Arizona State University. And I've actually been kind of catching your talks at ESIP off and on for years. And I just I'm so impressed with the work that you guys do. It's just fantastic. And so I appreciate you being here today again. And I always just love to hear about the kind of the advancements that you guys are making. But I guess well, this is such a great opportunity for me because I haven't had a chance to really ask this at ESIP. But one of the things I struggle with is, as an information manager, I'm really not sure how, I see where the work that I do. So I publish most of the work that I publish goes to Environmental Data Initiative.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And so I really see the value of when I submit data sets to EDI, how schema.org plays a really valuable role in the interaction and interplay and the discovery of those data sets and what have you. But it always is more at the Mark Sevilla level, at the EDI level. I'm really kind of struggling to see where myself as an information manager can really kind of capitalize on this tool at
Yeah.
my level. Do you have any comments on that? Any feedback on?
Boy, that's a good question. Yeah, because you're dealing with a repository and their sort of interpretation of schema.org, right? And across all the data sets that they see.
Yep.
Boy, so yeah, that's a really interesting question. One thing you could do if you really wanted to, so it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. And I really appreciate the question. If you feel like there's a level of granularity that's being missed at EDI that's very specific to your LTR site, and there's a ton of reasons why that would happen, and that makes sense. You could publish your own schema.org records on your LTR site web page. I think most LTR sites have that and put the data up on there. So you could do that, and there is a way for the major search engines to understand that, oh, the page that I'm seeing at this LTR site is describing the exact same data set at EDI. And that's almost a function of, how well LTR has managed their sort of DOI process.
Right.
So by you both publishing the same DOI as an identifier for that data set, folks like Data One and Google will understand that you're talking about two different data sets. And that there won't sort of be this, you won't be undermining EDI and vice versa. I don't know if that's what you're trying to accomplish. So please tell me if I'm, steering in the wrong direction.
No, that's a really great suggestion. And the LTRs kind of up to this point, they've kind of each LTR sites, there's 30 of us. We've maintained two separate data catalogs, so to speak. So most of the LTRs, they submit their data to EDI or one of the ocean repositories if it's an ocean site, and then they have a separate data catalog on their site, using at their site base, on whatever website they're using at their host institution. And so what you're describing there would work perfect in that scenario. Increasingly, though, what we're doing, thanks to the kind of just how we're advancing in the API space and how EDI and repositories in general are really kind of building such good infrastructure, is instead of having two separate catalogs of our data sets, we're just putting the stuff into EDI and then using the EDI API to kind of back populate local catalogs. So there's really only one source, but that's where I think, even though we're not maintaining, wouldn't need there's not a separate schema.org record in that sense. That's where it's really important to have that schema.org record has a lot of information that makes those data, increases the findability and discoverability of those data.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. I'd be curious to know. So some folks in the community, and you'll find this on the GitHub, is that they've made actionable crosswalks from certain metadata standards like ISO into schema.org. I don't know if one exists for EML, but anyway, if something like that was of interest to LTR community, that I think the network office folks, like, I don't know if Mark Schuldauer is still there. He's somewhat attached to the schema.org group. I think that would be something they'd be really interested in. Just to sort of, for the IMs to reduce the workload there. Like if you could leverage your EML record as a way to build a finer grained schema.org record for your LTER webpage, that would be interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
Anyway, maybe I was off there too, but
no, I don't think so. I think there's some real possibilities there for sure.
Yeah, obviously Data One and that whole group is heavily invested in EML. So I'd be curious to know if they don't have tools like that already. Certainly Data One's done some type of crosswalk into schema.org because they're publishing it for all their member nodes. So there might be some tools in their GitHub repositories there that might be of use right now.
Yeah, it could be. I know, Matt Jones really straddles both worlds. He's in the email, and I know he's at least talking about schema.org quite a bit. So, he's a nice kind of conduit for, speaking about all these things.
Yeah. But, if you have, curious or specific use cases that you like, hey, I really wish we could do this with it, that I think that would be really interesting for our cluster to hear and maybe brainstorm ways that would be a easy lift for IMs to adopt.
Right. Yeah, no, I think I think Adam, I'll start paying a little closer attention to your GitHub services there. Just check out these advancements a little more closely.
Great.
So I also want to check in with Melissa and see if she had any clarifying questions before we ended the recording.
No clarifying questions. I'll wait till after the recording. I do have a question for Adam. Thanks.
Excellent. In that case, thank you so much for talking with us, Adam, and I'm going to stop the recording here.
Okay. Thank you.